half asleep through the airport and onto the Gatwick Express. The first thing I really noticed was a sign in the cab saying, "Feel free to smoke." I smiled. That seemed so English. Experiencing a surge of patriotism, I smoked one as we nosed through traffic in the salubrious streets of Knightsbridge, then another as we crawled over the enormous flyover at Hammersmith and into the zone where the cab rates go up. By then, we were in Chiswick, a suburb on the western edge that still bears the traces of having been a village. It has a triangular green where in the summer they play cricket in the shadow of a church. There's an old-fashioned town hall where on this day the television film was being made. Actors in legal gowns and wigs were sitting in the sun playing charades. The last time I'd lived in London, my friend Dave had insisted I stay at his apartment. In the 2 years since then, he'd acquired a wife and a child, but he insisted there was still room. I let myself in. No one was home. Just as I was thinking of dropping my bags and going out for a walk, Dave returned in great haste, not even closing the front door. Scooping an article of baby clothing from the sofa and turning to leave, he said, "I've left him in the rented car. I'm just going to take it back. Do you want to come?" Outside in the car, after saying hello to the new arrival, who was sitting in the back seat with a grave, patient expression, I commented on Dave's hat. It had "World's Greatest Dad" written on the front. He snatched it off and stuffed it under his chair without a moment's hesitation and said, "Yeah, it is a bit weird, isn't it?" So earnestly, I had to laugh, because that seemed so English. That evening, I wanted to go to Hampstead Heath. Now, the closest tube station, Gunnersbury, was also served by a little-known overground line, the North London line, that should take me directly there. I bought a ticket from the electronic dispenser, but about halfway, the train stopped dead in this wide, desolate station set in the middle of a broad plain of scrapyards. This was Willesden Junction. A pre-recorded announcement from a tiny speaker on the wall said that the train would be going no further that day. It was the first I'd heard of it. So I got out and I went to an adjacent platform and I caught the first arriving train on a line I'd never even heard of before. All the announcements said this time was, "This is not the Euston train. This is not the Euston train." I got off at South Hampstead Station, where I was intercepted by a ticket inspector. They were a dying breed in those days and only seemed to appear at random. I explained my predicament, and he said, perfectly capturing to my mind the tone of British rail officialdom, "You've given yourself quite a walk." Indeed, I had. When I saw Hampstead Heath Station later that evening, it had red and white plastic tape stuck over the entrance, and there was a notice on the wall saying the station was closed for 6 months. Meanwhile, they were still selling tickets to it. That seemed so English. While I was walking back to South Hampstead Station after dark, I was kind of intercepted by this young guy who was dragging his girlfriend by the wrist. With many gestures and freakish pronunciation and many hesitations, he seemed to be asking for directions, but broke out laughing before he could get halfway through. England had played Holland in a big football game that evening, and I guessed this was his brilliant satire on foreigners asking for directions. He stood in the middle of the road, bent over as if retching with laughter, while his girlfriend kept tugging at his elbow to bring him away. I stepped back. That seemed so English. Tired from the day, I was by now tired of the way my mind was working. And normally I don't like or even quite trust meditations upon the mood or spirit of a nation, but that day I couldn't help myself. It was the summer of 1996, since the late spring of 1981, when I first set foot in Canada. I'd either been in Canada or I'd had my attention directed that way. And in that time, I'd noticed that every time I came back to England, The first few days I would be unable to resist making judgment. And perhaps I was encouraged by the way I felt. Other people would understand what I was talking about. I hadn't spent much time with English people while I was away, but those I spoke to all seemed to agree. What they missed the most was the irony. Okay, sometimes they said sarcasm, occasionally rudeness, but I sensed they were all talking about the same thing, which to me really was nothing but an insistence on never doing anything quite right. Well, everything I'd marked that day as particularly English was a part of that humor. But it always felt like fun at first, spotting it, and then it would feel like a trap. As unfailingly it seemed, my observations would take me through the same four emotional stations they had that day of amusement, affection, irritation, and disgust. And it seemed typical that the change of mood would happen around the railways because nothing seemed to unite the English in those days like the mordant deployment of expressions like leaves on the line and the wrong kind of snow. I mean, I don't think it was that people cared that much. The trains were always late, so much as there was a kind of widespread enthusiasm for pointing out what that lateness meant. And what it meant was obvious. Nothing works anymore. Everything's rotten. We're doomed. You know, maybe I only generalized like this in order to prove that I still care, to show that I still had the knack of sarcasm. I got home that day and Dave told me England had beaten Holland 4-1. He said, maybe it's to celebrate you coming back. I said, I'm not accepting that because I don't want to be held responsible when they lose on penalties in the semi-final. Everyone laughed. And I thought, I can still do the English comedy. Really, you know, I couldn't wait for the time when things stopped being typical of this or symbolic of that and just went back to being themselves. Great swathes of London, so featureless, without being slums, that no visitors come. One of these in the northwest stretches all the way from Acton up through Harlesden, Willesden, and Neasden. Outside Harlesden station stand a pair of 10-foot concrete pillars that might be meant to make up the number 11 or 77. They're covered in mosaic pictures of carnival, but the tiles are small and the colors are dingy from passing traffic. On this cloudy day, a young drunk was standing behind the lumps to piss. With his dark glasses and tight jeans, he could have been the coolest person on a Greek island 2 weeks earlier. Behind me, Acton Lane went waving through the industrial estates to Park Royal. To my right, the road curled past the rail yards to Willesden Junction, and I took the other route past the row of 3 shops towards Brent Community College and the Stonebridge Estate. Soon I passed what looked like a giant metal pizza by the side of the road. There was a notice beside it saying that there are 3 pieces of public sculpture in Harlesden. In a little street off a street, just off the main street, lived an old friend, Janet, with her 18-month-old son, Jim. She was waiting by the door with her coat. I hope you don't mind, she says, only I don't get out much these days. Really, there was nowhere we could go. There were no parks, there were no cafes. The only place we could take Jim was one of the pubs with a garden out there. Let's try that one, she said. A lot around here are dodgy. I ordered a coffee, something I couldn't have done in the old days. When it finally came, the milk was in a gravy jug. But we went out back, and there was a big garden with all these wooden trestle tables. Only one of the table had anyone sitting there. Little speaker on the wall played a Rolling Stones song every now and then and fell silent again. Jim stood watching 2 dogs loping along the far side of the canal. And Janet said, You're glad to be back? It's too soon to know. We walked back to her place. When we got there, the window cleaner was waiting outside. She said, "Can you come back in 2 weeks only? I'm having the place decorated." He had a square red face like a brick. He said, "Well, I'll be back in 2 weeks," like people who thought he wouldn't were just living in a dream world. We picked up some stuff for Jim and went walking again. And a few streets north, our walking created the illusion of white marble pillars rising majestically from the roof of an ordinary primary school. These pillars belonged to a temple so big, so white, looked as if it was brand new. A leaflet by the door told us that thousands of tons of Italian marble had been shipped to 12 sites in India and carved by 1,500 people before arriving here. When we got in, we had to take our shoes off. The young man said with a welcoming smile, "Just put them in a cubbyhole and remember the number." And then we walked into this square white hole. Every inch of every pillar was ornamented. Worshippers prostrated themselves before shrines. The security guards joked around in low voices. Even Jim fell silent. And then it was time for his nap, and for me to go see the other person who'd taken the trouble to stay in touch all the years I'd been in Canada. Mike had just become artistic director of a small but well-respected theatre that specialised in new writing. By the time I got to his office, it was the end of his working day, so he suggested we adjourn to this nearby French-style cafe that had these walls, I noticed, that were painted in a yellow that simultaneously suggested tobacco stains and lemon. And there was up on the wall, just above the toilet's door, was this little row of mock primitive drawings that looked like some private joke by the decorator. Anyway, Mike started talking with a certain characteristic cheerful gloom about the appalling state of British theatre, and I listened carefully. Over the years, he described himself as the sole light in a succession of darknesses. It was almost a modus operandi. Anyway, he interrupted himself to say, "What are you going to do? Do you know?" Might be quite hard to get started again. It's all about names now. No one knows you anymore. I suddenly realized that I'd seen an identical little set of mock primitive drawings in a completely different cafe. Actually, now I thought of it, they couldn't be a little private joke with a decorator. It had to be a corporate touch disguised as a little private individual wacky joke by the decorator. Just as I was finishing thinking this and turning my concentration back to Mike's talk, I realized that he was saying that there might, and he stressed, might be a part for me in the first play that he was going to direct. The problem was the playwright insisted on meeting me before I could be cast. He's up in Manchester. You'd have to pay your own way. Say if you don't want to. I said, yeah, I'll go. Okay. Have you got a phone? Well, you can leave a message on Dave's. Get a phone. Join in. When we parted, I bought myself a mobile phone. And I went for a walk. I was 42 years old. I'd had my first professional job at 18 and left for Canada at 27. Right now, those years before I went to Canada seemed ambiguous, like they might be the prelude to success or oblivion. I found myself by the gates of Kensington Gardens. I was drawn in. Night was descending, the rain falling in a haze, all was gloomy. But the careful, grand layout of the gardens, the mist joining up the horizon, the smoke over the trees, and the Canada geese walking up and down the flooded Serpentine all seemed very beautiful, and I began to think, tentatively, that I might be all right. I got lost. I found myself near Marble Arch. I wanted to catch the tube home, but the district line was down. So I took the central line as far as I could and then caught a bus. I sat in the upper deck. About halfway home, I noticed we seemed to have stopped for quite a long time. There was a mechanical sneezing, repetitive sound. One by one, my fellow passengers headed downstairs and didn't return. Eventually, I went down with them. And I saw that the doors were broken. The driver was sitting, rocking against the steering wheel, going, fuck, 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 fuck. So I just got off and waited for the next bus with everyone else. A few mornings later, I woke to hear the baby crying. Concerned not to get in the way, I went out. I had this idea, the more menacing because it was so vague, that at some point I was going to have to get myself sorted out. For example, I knew that much as I enjoyed living at Dave's, I knew if I didn't get my own place, and as soon as the going got tough, as it surely would, I'd leave town. But from somewhere I'd heard tales of terror about the difficulties of finding places to live, like stories about people having a bag full of coins, waiting for the evening paper coming out, ringing all the landlords they saw in the ads, going around there for interviews, waiting for it. I mean, really like a full-time job. I thought, best thing is, maybe, just to let myself get over the shock of arrival first. Just get some breakfast, read the newspapers. Well, the news agents, I noticed, as I approached it, had these rows of homemade ads that were like written on file cards with felt tip pen, the kind of things I kind of forgotten that they existed. I remember them from the film The Lavender Hill Mob, but I didn't know whether they still happened in England. Anyway, I was looking at those, and one of them had advertised an apartment to rent. So, and there was a number handwritten at the bottom of it. So I took the number down just as a gesture, stuffed it in my pocket, bought myself a newspaper, sat and had breakfast, read the paper from cover to cover, took my time. It was only as I was going back to Dave's that I kind of surprised myself by nipping into the telephone box and ringing this number I'd taken before. Rang for a long time, nearly gave up, until it was answered by a man whose accent sounded to me, sounded Caribbean. He said he did have a place to rent. It was £50 a week, and he would demand a £150 deposit, and he would be there at 3:00. Just to feel thorough, I went into a high street accommodation bureau. And there, a woman asked me to fill in a form. She explained that they would require a month's rent in advance, plus a deposit to the value of a month's rent, plus a £58 fee. So the sum before the keys could be handed over would be at least £800. Meanwhile, they would need to speak to my bank, my previous landlord, and my employer. She reached for the form, but I just crumpled it up because I didn't have a bank, landlord, an employer, or £800. So I walked to the place that might be my new address. Just as the landlord had said, the street was right opposite the tube station. It was a quiet, tree-lined arc. Number 63 wasn't as well appointed as some of them. I saw the front door was open, in fact, and I could see through to the garden at the back where there was a woman bent over working. And there was nothing to do but wait. I went back to Dave's, where I found that a card had arrived in the post for me from a shipping company based in a town called Dartford on the far east of London, saying that my stuff had arrived from Canada. So I phoned them up to ask them if I could come and pick it up. And they said, first, I had to send a C3 form that had accompanied the card to customs and excise in another small town in the far east of London called Barking. I took down an address, River Road, filled in the form, and on my way back to the possible new address, shoved it in the mailbox. And at 3 o'clock, I was in front of the house again. The front door was still open. I rang the doorbell. The woman in the garden, who still looked busy, called out to somebody. I heard the thump of feet on the stairs, and suddenly the door swung open. And I was faced with this older guy, South Asian in appearance, wearing a white linen suit, sandals, and spectacles with clip-on shades, currently tilted in the up position so that I could see what appeared to me to be, though what do I know, honest eyes. I rang. Oh, he turned around and went tramping up the stairs, assuming I was meant to follow. I did. And up one flight, just to the left, was the room in question. It was about 10 feet by 10 feet, with a single bed covered in a thin, colorless bedspread, a brand new but very cheap matching chest of drawers and wardrobe, an exhausted-looking armchair, and a table in the middle with a disastrous plastic cloth spread over it and 2 chairs tucked under it. On the wall above the table was a kind of smallish, framed, utterly dead alpine scene. And above and below that were wavy lines of blue where a big poster had been stuck. Carpet was concrete grey, flecked with cigarette burns. And in the corner was the nondescript cupboard that had been painted white. I assume it was for food because on top of it was an electric cooker with 1 ring. Next to that was a fridge. Next to that was a sink with 1 cold tap and a water heater stuck on the wall above with a thin metal tap with grey plastic nozzle. He stepped forward, turned on the water heater, and because the grey plastic nozzle was rotting, the water kind of sprayed out of the sides of it, even onto the bed. We stood there for about 3 minutes waiting for the water to warm up at all. Stayed stone cold. My hand was aching by the time he went, "Okay?" "Yeah," I said, and we walked up the hall to the shared toilet. There, underneath the sink, hidden behind a little green curtain, was a meter for the shower that took old 10-pence pieces that were no longer legal tender, but which were, he assured me, readily available at most banks if you asked nicely. And next to that was, instead of a rubbish bin, was a plastic tub that used to hold wall grout. It always seems to me, in a situation like this, the key thing is whether you think the guy is all right. And I did. Somehow I had a hunch he was a decent kind of fellow. He stood in the middle of the room. He said that he required a week's rent in advance, plus £30 to cover the days leading up to the beginning of the week, plus the £150 deposit he'd mentioned earlier, plus £10 to pay a solicitor for making up the agreement. He was staring straight ahead like he was willing his mind to compute all these figures. Incongruously, I felt I had the advantage because I could add all that up. So I took the money out of my pocket and I put it in his hand and I asked him for a receipt. He didn't have paper or a pen. So I took a notebook out of my pocket and together we composed something that sounded sensible. Didn't charge £10 for it either. He signed that. As the 2 of us walked back towards the main road, he told me that the last person who'd lived in that room had been a decent guy, adding that I seemed like a decent guy too. I said, "I hope you're still saying that in 6 months," and we laughed. I asked him where he was from. He told me he'd been born in British Guyana. The British did many bad things there and were forced to leave. I had already come to London by then. Ah, that's my boss. And off he jumped as fast as his floppy sandals would allow. I went to Dave's place to pick up my belongings, carried them over, dropped him in the middle of the floor and sat down. And that's when I realized that in my haste to ascertain the moral standing of the landlord, I'd forgotten to check the chair. The central spring had gone completely. It was impossible to sit in. It wasn't a chair, it was a chair-shaped thing. Thank you very much for coming.